Good evening and welcome to the third of the series around trading the presidential election for 2020. It's always great to be back and particularly considering it's now getting quite exciting and ramping right up. It's also good to see that there was questions that have come in from last one and leading into this one. So before I go any further, as always, if you are new to these sessions and you're listening for the first time live, over on your GoToWebinar control panel, there is obviously a questions section. I actually tend to like to answer those questions straight away. So if you do have a question when I'm talking, please just fire them up. I'll basically interrupt myself and read them out. If you can put your name to it, you don't have to, but it's obviously better if we can have a discussion with your name to it. The other thing that I also say when I start these discussions, and I'll say this every single time, I don't know the right answer. I can't profess to know every single thing, and no one can. The whole idea of this discussion and why we're having this debate and doing these presentations is to work as a unit. If we can work as a unit and actually, discuss what we're thinking as a unit, that removes mistakes, it removes the ideas that can sort of get in the way. Look, I know there's always a great thing to be out there to be a contrarian, and I completely understand that point of view as well. But the whole idea of this is that if you've also got a suggestion or an answer or an idea, put that in the question section as well. I'm very happy to read it out. The final thing before I move on is the other thing about when we do this, I want to put my hands up very, very clearly and say I am trying to be as apolitical as possible. Personally, the US, I love watching it. I love breathing the US elections. I think it's an amazing country. It's a place that I think everybody should visit at least once in their lives. And I've been there several times myself, luckily enough. But it's not my country. And the reason I say that is that whatever happens in the election, it's not going to directly affect me politically because, as I said, I don't live there. I'm not an American citizen, and therefore I have no right to make a comment either way, in my view. So, as I said from the start, I am not here to be partisan. I'm not here to try and say one candidate is better than another. If you take it that way, I apologize. I am trying very hard to just basically go through what the data is telling us, what the market is telling us, to then be able to trade that. Because that's realistically, if we can block out the partisan noise, if we can block out our own personal biases and listen to the consensus and what have you, it's going to remove mistakes. So they're the three things to sort of that I always have talked about when I've started these. And I know I'm looking at the attendee list. There's a lot of you here that have been for the last two. So apologies if I'm going over myself. But just remember, questions, stick them up there as fast as we possibly can. If you've got an idea, stick it up there as fast as you can because I'll read it out as well. And as I said, this is an apolitical point of view. I'm not trying to make any partisan politics. And again, I apologize if you think I am. I'm trying not to. I'm trying to be as honest and open as about what the data is telling us to then make inverted commas as much of an informed decision as I can. And the final part, as I said, I don't necessarily know all the answers. I wish I did, because if I did, I'd be sitting on a beach somewhere. But I'm here just like you, learning every day, trading every day, and trying to get better and better. And for that reason, that's why we're all here to do this. So, as always, hang on a sec. As always, don't forget, have a very good read of this. Everything in this discussion tonight is general in nature. None of it should be taken as any form of personal advice. FP Markets does not know your personal scenario, nor do I. And I'm a contractor to FP Markets. I'm not an employee of FP Markets. I'm a contractor to them. So just remember, this is all general tonight. And as I said, the best thing about tonight is to make sure that we are discussing this as a group, that we're getting as many ideas as a group, and trying to make this as informative as we possibly can. So I have been deliberately putting this up each and every time. The one in the top right-hand corner was last week. This is as of this afternoon. I took this deliberately at what would have been around about 10 p.m. Eastern time in the US. So at least it gives you the shut-off date of what was going on yesterday for the US, which was the 19th of October. All of this charts and the data that I'm going to talk to you about and show you going forward is for the 19th. So it's basically the most up-to-date pieces of data we have from the US because they're obviously behind for me here in Australia. But if you are listening or watching this overseas, obviously different time zones, I understand that. But just be aware, it's very interesting that the one to look here is Minnesota. It has dropped out. It is now back into a toss-up. And as we discussed last week, that is absolutely core to this. Those that did come and looked at the purple haze, Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota are the 5 that we're watching very closely. In my view, they're the ones that will probably actually decide the election. There are a few out there, others that can actually move the dial. Places like Ohio, places like North Carolina, possibly Georgia, which I still find fascinating. But just to let you know, the toss-up has dropped back to, and those 10 additional college votes that have come out have come from Minnesota, and therefore, again, just makes that ability and that idea that the market, and probably, and I'll show you all this in a minute, the betting markets have got around a Biden win may not be as clear cut as some are saying. So with that comment, I am just going to read this out. We did get a question during the week, and I know that you're online. I think it's from Kai. Kai, I did see you in there. The question came from Kai was this: Trump winning equals risk on equals US dollar down. Trump losing equals risk off equals US dollar up. Right now, polls/betting agencies are backing a Biden presidency. But looking at the falling US dollar, markets are backing a Trump win. Is that the right way of looking at it? It's a brilliant question because you're right. The markets, and this is something we went through in the very first discussion that we had way back in this before the first debate, was that what we have seen for the last 28 years, back to 1992, is that whenever an incumbency administration, because obviously you can only be a president for 2 terms in a row, for every time you've seen an administration change over, you have seen a rising US dollar and a falling US equity market. The reverse is happening right now. And that is why that question from Kai is fascinating, because yes, that could be a way of interpreting it. Markets are suggesting that actually they think Trump could win. And talking to those on the ground, never write him off. As good as polls have got in terms of removing the bias, removing the inability to contact what they call the silent Trump voter, that is possibly changed. But in saying that, there is still a decent margin of error, and it's about 3%. So as of yesterday in the US, Biden's overall across the national average poll, he's sitting at about 9.6% ahead. But again, if you put the margin of error in there, okay, it brings it down to 6-ish. But even saying that, when you actually drill into those purple haze states, it gets closer again. So it's much, much closer than I think we're giving it credit for. So what I want to talk about tonight is what happens on election day and post the election day, how we're going to trade it. This is the other thing. How are we going to trade this? And you need to then start having a little bit of an understanding about what might happen on the day. But more importantly, it's growing. What we just discussed before with this chart here is that it is growing probable that we will have a contested versus an accepted election. The other thing that's going to happen more so than any other election in modern era history is the amount of postal votes. It is why the president is using this as a go-to. This is where the fraud part comes about because of COVID, because people don't necessarily want to go out. Now, you have probably seen some photos online and videos online of, people standing out in line to vote early in, hours to hour-long queues. But there is also a known movement at the moment that the amount of basically ballot votes are through the roof. So I thought this would be very good. I got this off the AP, which I think is a very good neutral way of looking at it. These are the key dates that now happen all the way up to Jan 20. Jan 20 is when the election, when the actual president is sworn in. That happens no matter what on every single election. It's part of the written into the Constitution that the 20th of January following the November 3rd or the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November, yes, that is quite a tongue tie, that's when it has to happen. So there's a lot to go on between the 3rd of November and Jan 20. So this here, as I said, between the 5th of November and December 12th, deadlines of each state become basically due. You can see, as it says, that there are varying ones. The clarification for election results happen inside there. The other thing that this doesn't have that I think I should put out there, and I put it on the right-hand side in a dot point, December 8 has what they call the safe harbor rule. And that's where if a state actually declares its final vote is conclusive, even if it means mail-in votes are still coming, absentee, overseas ballots are still being received, if it says before December 8th that, yep, our final vote is X, that is taken as conclusive, and therefore all electoral college votes are taken for that state. Even if, for inverted commas, and just say for complete arguments, hypothetical stake, the absentee and mail-in votes all of a sudden pushed it the other way. So the example would be, let's look at Minnesota, for example. Minnesota, very, very tight. Let's say on the 7th of December, they actually say, safe harbor, we're declaring it's for Trump. And then you've got all these mail-in and absentee votes that are registered in Minnesota and it pushed it to Biden. They won't count. So that's why this timeline is so important in terms of what happens. And it's an amazing scenario to have that. And then, as you can see, by December 14, the electors cast their ballots. And why that also matters is that if that safe harbor vote has happened, those state candidates have to declare for what was handed in before the December 8th. So again, the Minnesota idea, they would have to award the 10 electoral college votes to Trump, even if the state after the fact could actually swing the other way. I'm going to leave what happens in January alone, because if we get down to Jan 6 with the joint sessions of conveniences, etc., and also then the president swearing in with a contested scenario, tonight I don't have enough time to talk about it. It is incredibly complex. It's very, very legal. You may or may not have seen that there are positions and possibilities of somebody like Nancy Pelosi becoming president. In that scenario, it's very, very long-winded, but the idea basically is if a contested election happens, if the Supreme Court can't separate the candidates and there's no way of settling it, blah, 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 Jan 20 comes along, as the leader of the House, she actually basically falls over the line automatically. And that's just a very, very, very rough way of saying it. But that's roughly how Nancy Pelosi could become the president of the United States. And there is, inverted commas, still that chance that it could happen. And don't write it off. But that's why that's also on here, that Jan 20 timeline and where we sit. I'm going to move on, because otherwise I think there's more important stuff to be talking about tonight than just this. But just keep these dates in mind, because when it comes to our trading, for us here in Australia, and I'll keep talking about it in Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, on November 4, if the result can't be declared, all of a sudden this timeline has to become part of your thinking with your trades. It has to become part of your thinking with your positioning as well, because there now could be weeks, possibly even 2 months before we know the result. And I'll show you at the end here what that would mean for vol, and volatility will be a clear key part of what happens on the 4th and going forward. It will also be a big, big driver of equities and FX. There's no doubt about that. And something I don't normally talk about, but I will quickly mention it, gold will also be part of that whole idea. It would be a big risk event if all of a sudden we have this sort of limbo position where we sit, where we don't know who's going to be the president of the United States for the 117th sitting, and that would be quite a statute to be in, considering COVID is going on. We're moving into a winter in the Northern Hemisphere, and there's a lot of other things outstanding. So don't also forget, we're not just talking about the president's election and with regards to who runs to the White House. We are also talking about the Senate, and we are also talking about the House. What this is here, and why this also matters, is because part of the trading that we're going to have to think about is there's 4 possible scenarios. The scenarios are blue wave, where the Democrats take the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Light blue, where they take the White House, they keep the House, but don't win the Senate. Where the status quo is maintained. So the current setup is where you have the Republicans in the White House, so Trump as president, they have the Senate, but they don't control the House. The last option would be what they call red, red, red. And that's pretty clear what that is. That's the president, the House, and the Senate. All of those will come with different permutations about how things move. All of those come with different permutations about what policy would be implemented and what that would also mean for FX and particularly equities in the US. So on the left-hand side, this is the current setup of the Senate. Even with the second ballot that came in 2018, Democrats hold 47 seats, the Republicans hold 53. On the right-hand side, this is the possible scenario that's going on right now. And as I said, apologies, this one actually I couldn't get any earlier, any later than the 16th because there hasn't actually been another poll being held since the 16th of October. But you can see that very clearly that what is also there are 35 Senate seats up for grabs. 12 of them are Democrat seats, 23 of them are Republican seats. So that's why the map on the left and the right don't match, because most of the Senates in places like California, Nevada, Utah aren't up for redoing, but the other states you can see that there are in actual colors are. It's also interesting that obviously just the way that the cookie crumbles with regards to times, that there are obviously 23 Republicans versus 12 Democrats up for it. Some people will complain about that being unfair. It actually was the complete opposite in the 2018. The Dems had more people up for re-election versus the Repubs. It's just what's happening this time around. And that's what's interesting is that currently looking at the polls for the Senate, there's a chance, and I say that deliberately, there is a chance the Democrats could take it. You technically need 50 to get across the line. And that's why still a long way to go in the Senate. The Senate, I think, is actually one of the most interesting parts of this whole election because we all know at the moment the Senate's where there is real issues with regards to the hold up around legislation. So Nancy Pelosi, although she's the head of the leader of the House, she's having to negotiate with Steve Mnuchin, who's part of the Senate. Mitch McConnell, who's the majority leader in the Senate, is also part of the reason we're having big hold-ups with legislation. And whoever controls the Senate will probably control how policy works in the US going forward. The House, same principle in terms of what's going on here. It's much more open in terms of it, is that the whole House is up for redoing. Again, on the left-hand side, it is with the current sitting. So that includes this is the 2018 setup, because we did have a half election during that. And you can see the Democrats took the House back after 2016, where there was a red finish. We know about that. It's clearly also part of the reason why we're having a bit of gridlock, if we're honest, in terms of that space. But again, if you have a look at that, the Democrats are actually starting to fall back. There are 23 toss-ups in there, and there is a chance that all of a sudden the Dems control the House could become a minority, or even they could lose it. Don't ever write that off. If you have a look and compare those two maps of America, the toss-up areas tend to be Democrat-held House seats. And that's what makes this so incredibly interesting, because never write off Trump as an incredible person and an incredible campaigner. And he is that. And that's why everybody's talking about the president and the Senate. I'm still of this view that it's an absolute open race. And there is still a chance, and it is a small one, I granted with all the information, but there is still a chance a red scenario comes off. And this shows that to you, is that if you can just anecdotally look at this and see, actually just eyeballing all of this, the majority of the places that are up that could become under pressure in the House are controlled by the Democrats. Excuse me, I'm just having a drink. And that all brings into, again, policy, direction, who can say what, when, and how, what it means for the dollar, what it means for stimulus packages, what it means for the economy. All of those kinds of things are part of the question that comes from all this, and why these two maps to me are so incredibly important, along with the ones before. Is it's not just about who ends up in the Oval Office. It could actually also be about who ends up controlling Capitol Hill, and how Capitol Hill actually is sitting in their current scenarios. Just before I go any further, don't forget, guys, if you've got questions, stick them in there right now or whenever you feel confident to do so. I know I'm moving quickly at the moment. I do apologize, but I think it's much better to sort of keep going through and getting towards the end where inverted commas, some of the more exciting stuff is actually happening. So what does the blue wave mean? As I said, House, Senate, and the president. From what we know, listening to coming from Biden and his side, is that strong government spending is very, very probable. We know there'll be fiscal expansion. That is also clear. We know that there will be deficit spending, and there will be clearly a very fast movement of the debt ceiling in the US. There is also regulation that's likely to come in. We know that Biden has been pretty strong around the Keystone Project, which I've spoken to you about before. It's part of the reason, getting back to Kai's point about the markets. One of the things that the markets are still very much picking up from on a sector basis in the US. Now, I understand oil's under pressure, but if you have seen as the polls got stronger, oil hasn't really moved probably for about 4 or 5 months after that horrific movements that they saw in January and May. But as he's got closer, the prospect of seeing some form of regulation or even a possibility of stopping the Keystone Project, oil and the energy sector in the US has really fallen away quite rapidly. And maybe that's the market pricing in this idea that a blue wave could happen and we get regulation on that side. Just before I go any further, Evan's got a question. Is Trump any chance of winning the popular vote? Probably not. Now, why I say that is that the popular vote is a very hard one because the East and West coasts are population heavy. So if you look at California, you look at places like Washington State, then you go up into the East and you got, all those kind of places like New York State, New Jersey, you go up into Connecticut, Massachusetts. All those kinds of states are very, very heavily populated and tend to vote Democrat. They can be overwhelmed by Florida and sort of those places like Georgia, South Carolina, but they don't have the same volume of people when you start taking in those bigger states. Like I said, like California is a prime example of just volume taking over. Now, don't get me wrong, there are parts of California that are very, very strong Republican. Don't get me wrong at all. But when you start looking at places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, these kinds of places, they're pretty blue, and there's volume behind them. So I'll be honest with you, though, the popular vote doesn't matter. It's interesting, and there's always that discussion about whether or not it's fair and reasonable that, the candidate that got in didn't necessarily win the popular vote, but that happens everywhere. That's not just a US problem. That happens globally in terms of how it is. The system is designed to try and spread out and make things even. And the amazing thing about the US scenario in the election is that the Constitution wrote this way back when, so we're talking almost 250, 300 years ago, that they haven't really changed it much. Whereas, again, we'll use the example here in Australia, the AEC here does tend to move the seat electoral boundaries around all the time to try and even things out. So again, the popular vote is probably an interesting sort of thing to look at, but in terms of what it means, probably means very little. I hope that answers your question, Evan. Going a little bit further, apologies. Light blue, as I said before, the interesting thing about light blue, it would probably be the flip of what we currently have. So there'd be gridlock in the Senate because the Republicans would control it. It would continue to lead to the fiscal impasses that we've been experiencing. Probably would mean that we'd see global tensions ease. China and Europe obviously have been a big part of how Trump has carried his international diplomacy. He's clearly put a lot of pressure on countries that are high manufacturing that he sees as anti-US. And part of his Make America Great Again strategy has been to target these places to try and basically, even up, inverted commas, trade balances. Interesting thing about the China to US trade balance is that when he took over, it was at a record level. It has come back, but it's now at the same level that it was when Barack Obama took over, which was around about 17 times more in deficit than when it was basically neutral back in 1992. So it's an interesting one. He certainly has got that trade deficit moving back slightly, but nowhere near the levels that I think he wanted them to. The way he's negotiated with China has been interesting, but you would assume that a Biden presidency will be different in that fact. And some people don't like the possibility and probability, in fact, that he would be more of a softly approach with China than what he is. There is, fairly decent reasons to be talking about and talking with China about how they do trade and how they use persuasion, inverted commas, it's to their advantage. Europe would probably be also taking a little bit of a breather here. He has clearly had fractious relationships with Angela Merkel and particularly with German manufacturing. German manufacturing is astoundingly good, and it is a big threat and has been a big threat to the US for a long time. And that's why he's taken that stance. It's also France is another one. So they would probably breathe a sigh of relief, having to negotiate with a Biden president rather than a Trump president 2.0. Then he'd also say that COVID bills would take some time to pass. The interesting one is this one, the status quo. What we would probably see and what you're already hearing from his pro-Trump supporters, if he returns as is, which is that he becomes president, Senate's Republic, House it holds as the Democrats. It would be interesting if it flipped where the Democrats took the Senate, but they lost the House. Again, let's not go through that permutation, but this would give the president an absolute reason to go on the offensive. He would be very strong in his position, and rightly so. He's won the election, to go absolutely all out in nationalism. He would probably go all out in the wall. He would also suggest that they should open up the country faster to get the economy moving. However, he does have, inverted commas, some check with the House. It'd probably create gridlock there from unorthodox policy. But his ability to probably get through stimulus that he wants has to be given, because again, if you win the election, the people have spoken, and you need to listen to that. The other thing to be there is tax relief. There's a chart, there's a box that I'll bring up in a minute that's actually from Morgan Stanley that shows. So the current corporate tax rate in the US is 21%. There is suggestions that he could go out of nowhere with more tax relief, and trying to be as competitive in his view as he could be, with competitors like China, and tax relief is part of that, and trying to drive up the wealth effect as hard as he can, really sort of playing to his constituency on that idea. And that would be very interesting. But as I said, if he wins, even if he just gets across the line and nothing changes to how we have today, it will definitely put him in the ascendancy, as it should, and it would be a way. The interesting scenario would be the red, where he would be absolutely ramping up his policy, and it's his kind of policies. Those very much around economics, those very much around tax, very much around driving business front and center, relaxing COVID restrictions. Nationalism would clearly be part of his whole idea. His tensions with China, Russia is another one to then throw in there, would also be up there. I think he'd actually start talking Russia up, and doing similar things to what he's done this time around with regards to North Korea. There's growing suggestions before the COVID hit, he was going to start at the start of the year to start talking with Vladimir Putin and go from there. And then the other thing that would happen is that regulations, like I said, with regards to what Biden's bringing in, with those regulations would completely abate. He would let it go and very much let anything that's seen as economically positive over anything else would probably happen. Clearly, there's an environmental part of why Biden's arguing to do what he's doing, and Trump obviously would completely distance himself from that and let things run as he could. So they're the four. They're the four scenarios that could happen at the election, and then obviously finding out over the next 2 months before the 20th of January. It's a fascinating scenario because clearly when you think about those four scenarios, they're incredibly different. How the market reacts to them is obviously very interesting. So what I've done here, if you haven't been on predictit.org, it is a fantastic website. It is one of the most used betting and political websites on the planet. I stick it on your, if you've got a pen and paper, write it down or whatever you want to do. or even while you're sitting here listening to your computer, go onto it because you don't necessarily have to see this, but you can see here, these are according to predicted, and you can see the volumes of trades going through there as well. This is, so that's what the left-hand column is. So 90,000 trades went through on, September 22nd. So it does give you volume of trades going through. That's why this is so important to how and why I actually put a lot of credence on this. As we discussed last week, volume means people are likely to be going, actually, I'm going to put X on Biden because because I'm going to vote for him and I think he's going to win, or vice versa. What this is showing here is that these are the scenarios around we've just discussed. The House and the Senate taken by the Dems, the House and the taken by the Dems, the Republicans take the Senate, so on and so forth. Won't read out the rest of the legend, but you can see that there is, basically at the moment, the blue wave is sitting at around about 63 cents in the dollar. So basically 63%, according to predicted. Now, I will again put my hand up very clearly and say this is not definitive. Clearly, it will miss people, clearly, but it's pretty good understanding of positioning. But what is interesting is that you're just starting to see a little tick down in that scenario and a slight tick up in the status quo scenario. Sorry, not the status quo scenario, in the red scenario, which is interesting. It's still a long way away. That gap is ginormous. So I'm not going to deny that the spread there is astronomical, but we're getting closer. Trump is on the warpath. He's in the purple zones and he's in the purple haze, so that can get closer. But it is an interesting one, and markets. So getting back to Kai's question right at the start, it plays into this. And could we be seeing for the first time in 28 years markets actually reversing their opinion and reversing their view that actually a Biden presidency would be better for markets than not? What I will do, I'll just very quickly stop there and say, if you didn't see the other day, Lloyd Blankfeld, for those of you who don't know who he is, he's the former head of Goldman Sachs, put out a very interesting tweet to suggest that maybe, just maybe, markets are waking up to the idea that they want a president that's not going to attack their society and is for the good of their society, rather than somebody that is just straight for their tax return. It's an interesting sort of swipe at Trump, and again, trying to be apolitical. But it's an interesting point from what is sometimes described as the vampire squid, in the former head of Goldman Sachs, to actually point out that maybe markets need to start thinking about the whole and a holistic view of how the country should be run, rather than just one very, very narrow-minded idea of lowering tax rates, expanding economics at any cost to go forward. Just a thought. Right. This is also, and apologies, that's come out quite unclear. I do apologize for that. I put this together this afternoon. Again, I have tried to take as many different points of view as I possibly can to try and get as many inputs and helping us actually make some form of informed ideas and decisions when we trade around it. So top box, pretty obvious what that is with regards to who's going to win the presidential election. For those of you that haven't seen 538, it is an amazing website. They've got a brilliant podcast, and a lot of what's coming out of that is fantastic. They have been running polls basically all year, and their polls have been getting wider and wider in terms of that is, and they now have an 88% chance that Biden can take the presidency. Similar same for Super Forecaster. Again, beautiful website, very, very well run, has lots of different inputs and very much lots of eyes on the ground. What I've done with Real Clear Politics, the thing there which says no toss-ups, what they're doing there is that they are removing the toss-up states. Now, as I showed you right at the start, the moment there's, hang on, let me make sure I get that right. There's 197, so there is a huge, margin of error with this call. But they have then assigned what the polls are leaning to, and that's where they come out at when you take out the no toss-up seats. That apologies, I've actually put that around the wrong way. My bad. For both the next two, they've actually got Biden on 375 and Trump at 181. And the same for the Cook report. I do apologize. That's my mistake. That's sloppy. Apologies, amateur. Betting markets, again, can show you the same thing with regards to what's going on. In fact, I think this is something that has gone wrong with my computer feed because it's completely flipped everything around. Again, apologies for all of that. What I need you to think about here with this picture is that my feed in from my computer has taken the fact that when they reading this, it actually had Biden Trump first because it was going in alphabetical order rather than going President Trump, Vice President Biden. So the top two are correct. Everything else is in the wrong place. I do apologize. That's, as I said, quite amateur. It's the same also with the House and the Senate. So predict it has the Democrats to win. It has, again, for the control of the Senate, it actually has the Democrats across the board. So the blue wave is the probability. In terms of what markets are saying, in terms of what betting markets are saying. Again, though, there's a part of me that just knows that it's just not that clear cut in terms of what's going on, and that's where trading comes into it. And what's happening here. This, I know it's a bit of a noisy chart, but I think it's a really good idea, is to show that at the moment, if you look at what Refinitiv are taking with regards to the spread between Biden and Trump of the national polling average, it is growing. So according to theirs, so this isn't a collation of all the polls, which is what RCP does. This is what Refinitiv are getting. So their spread now is at 10.2. The consensus is sitting at 9.6. So it's close enough. And you can see it's really started to take off basically since the first presidential debate. Has all of a sudden it's gone from being around about 6 to all the way up to 10.2. And as you can see from their chart, it's getting stronger. What's also been interesting since then is as we've been getting closer and closer to the election, even with what's going on with COVID, and this is where I want to take you to the red line, is volatility is falling away. And why that's interesting, this is also something that is bucking a 28-year trend, is that normally leading into the election, volatility keeps getting stronger and stronger. It doesn't matter who's winning or who's going to win. Volatility just gets higher and higher because there's a level of uncertainty that comes with this idea. It is incredibly interesting to see VIX falling like this. It's not something you see. Now, clearly, VIX is elevated significantly compared to historical averages. You've therefore got to factor in how much of that volatility is down to the global issue around COVID, or is it around the presidential election? I think you've got to probably factor in COVID into this. You can see that the big movement in volatility in February, March, April is down to that, and the big unknown that was coming with what this global pandemic could be, and it's still being priced in. I think that is clear. So I take some of that with a pinch of salt. But again, a market's getting confident and more confident with a Biden presidency, considering most agencies, betting agency volume of bets going through are suggesting that Biden's going to win. It's certainly getting into that possibility. And a lot of people that I've been talking to are trading vol, being slightly short it leading into the election, but are wanting to step away from it the day before. Particularly some of the big traders that I talk to, they're using vol to their advantage. They think vol will continue to sort of ease off. They've got very close stops because the other thing about vol that they're worried about is COVID, particularly in Europe. The second wave does get completely out of hand, which looks like it could. Vol will probably jump up, and I think that's a foregone conclusion if all of a sudden you saw big shutdowns of places like Germany and France, as in lockdowns that have been experienced for us here in Victoria, where I'm currently talking from. That would obviously just be a global economic, slowdown straight there and now, and that would therefore be a complete overrider, even with how prominent, a US election can be to global economics. That would be a fairly catastrophic thing. And the other part that would come part of that question and slash answer would be how much of an impact does that have on your Black Friday sales, your Cyber Mondays, and then your Christmas sales. All of that would be part of that question. But it is interesting that a lot of them are trading short vol because they believe that at the moment, particularly in the equity market is getting more and more confident around a change of administration. and what that could actually mean for themselves. Bear with me for 1 second. Finally, part there is obviously the uncertainty index of the world economic policy, and it's falling as well. It's not a huge part of what we need to think about, but it is part of that overall thought process there as well. But that's, for me, part of the reason I wanted to show you this is the VIX trade, and it's certainly something that a lot of traders are looking at the moment as it's an extra level of risk. It can move quite quickly, I understand that, but when we're talking about the US election, we are probably intraday, intra-week trading. As a longer term idea rather than sort of looking to intra-month or even intra-year. Just another way to look at it as well is just to show you that the volatility index is definitely easing off, and it's coming. The spread that's becoming between November and December is also easing away quite strongly. It's probably again down to more certainty about understanding about where both candidates sit and the probability of where we could find ourselves coming to that as well. So again, I've said this from the start and I'll say it again. I don't know all the answers, nor does Morgan Stanley, but I did want to show you this because I think this is one of the best overviews that I've seen out there with regards to how you possibly trade what could happen on the day and then for the 2 months after the fact if we don't have a clear-cut scenario. I've deliberately highlighted the Democrat blue wave because obviously the betting markets are suggesting that's at the moment, inverted commas, the most likely scenario. But in saying that, I actually personally think it's more likely going to be the middle two. That the president gets changed, but the House and Senate doesn't move, or the president holds on and the House and Senate doesn't move. And I think that's what's more interesting. What I'd also point out very clearly there is a corporate tax rate, according to Morgan Stanley, under a Biden presidency would go up. We know he's talked about those earning more than $400,000 a year would see a tax increase, and corporate tax is also part of that. Fiscal impulse is the next part as well, as we know that both sides of politics want to do it. It's just how and who gets it that's different. And what would be the most detrimental, according to most scenarios, and this isn't just Morgan Stanley's point of view, this is actually the consensus view, is that Biden winning but nothing changing actually is likely to have the biggest impasse in there, in that the Republicans are likely to put up roadblocks in the Senate, as we're seeing right now, because the way that the Democrats want to do their policy around easing is more Social Security rather than actually economically stimulative in that space. But what this chart also shows you is Kai's question feeds into it. So have a look at that first line with regard to the S&P 500. Morgan Stanley are actually predicting that the market will fall if Biden wins. They're predicting the market to rise if Trump wins. And that therefore gets back to that theory that we've seen for the last 28 years, is that if an incumbent administration holds on, the market in terms of equities goes up and the US dollar falls away. And you can then cast your eye down the line, having a look at CAD, Euro, Pound, Yen. It plays out pretty much the same principle in that space. It's also interesting, though, to have a look at what would be there with regards to what we're actually suggesting there is that you could actually see risk on as well. So it's why this is so hard at the moment in terms of how people look at it, is that there could actually be a flip, because you actually have a look at euro dollar is actually going up there, and that's a risk on event, whereas Trump is seen as a risk off event considering the current price to where it could end up. So there's so many permutations around it, and that's why the one that I think you've got in the back of your head is that the blue wave probably means volatility continues to fall, but the US markets post the date will likely fall to the year end. That's what EY20 stands for. You're also likely to see some form of risk on an FX for both sides, because both sides of politics are talking about stimulus and fairly high level of stimulation. That means real rates are going to move. It will therefore mean that it's a US dollar negative because of that level of stimulation. It's a risk on trading movement, and you can see that in currencies across the board. So that's why we've just got to basically also make sure we choose the markets we want to go into. Do you want to go into indices? Do you want to go into FX? Know that and understand it. If I'm going to FX, which pair am I going to go at, or am I just going to go the basket and have a look at it that way? And again, if you look at this scenario here, if you had a look at the basket, it'd probably average you out and drop away a little bit of the volatility that can come with an individual pair. But at the same time, you can see that the variations between movements will probably be different because clearly cable, so pound US and sterling US, is much more risky in the current involvement in the current market with what's going on in the UK, the possibility that Brexit now looks like failing, coupled with an unknown scenario with who ends up in the White House. Cable could go absolutely all over the shot, whereas euro dollar will be much more stable. And for me, if it was me, and it's just me as an idea, again, smoothing that out a little bit just gives me a bit more confidence with something like basket rather than this as well. What I'm going to do is I am going to stop talking there. I've spoken a lot. There is a lot to take in. And again, I'm going to say this once more. I don't know the full answer, and I don't think anybody does. The scenarios are so varied, and the outcomes very clouded. We therefore need to be ready and wary of that. But these are possible outcomes and scenarios that could play to it. And there is good trades to be made. There's good money to be made, but also doing it with risk mitigation is also part of it. So I'm going to stop there and open up to questions and hopefully have something for you that can help. Are there any questions? Don't forget, over on your GoToWebinar section, there's the question section. Just drop it down. And please, by all means, just stick in what you've got, and away we go. No worries, Nazir. Nazir just running through. Thanks, Evan. Mate, good luck to you. Hope to speak to you soon. Here we go. Question from Mark. If Trump wins Florida, is it highly likely that he goes on to win the election with 270 votes? Mark, yes, it is. It would mean everything therefore comes down to Pennsylvania. There is growing expectation that Florida is getting closer and closer and closer and closer, and that he could actually win it. So yes, Florida, as I said last week, I actually think Florida is the key to this. Whoever wins Florida, in my view, will probably go on to win. And there is still every chance that he could. So in short, yes, I do believe, Mark, that if he wins Florida, I reckon he'll hold on. Kai, thanks for the seminar. So many permutations regarding risk on, risk off. We'll have to rewatch it. Very interesting. Thanks, Kai, and thanks for your question during the week. As I said last time as well, if you guys do have a question you think of during the week that you didn't get to tonight, please fire it into FP and we'll go over it again sometime in the future. Any more questions? Another one from Mark. Do you agree with Biden loses Florida, he can still win? As I said, that would mean it all comes down to Pennsylvania. So Florida holds 29 electoral college votes. Pennsylvania holds 20. He's got, at the moment anyway, a decent lead. Florida would be a big dent. He would then have to pretty much make sure that not only does he pick up Pennsylvania, but he needs to pick up Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin to basically give him the ability to not have a contested election. And I think that needs to be put part of it. North Carolina is an interesting one as well, Mark. I agree with that. Who knows? North Carolina could be anything. It's a big play because it's 16 in terms of its numbers as well. I still personally believe that North Carolina will end up going to Trump. So I haven't really included it in my maths around getting to 270. So it's a question of whether or not the Rust Belt has seen enough economic prosperity in the last 4 years to stay with Trump, or whether or not they again flip, because they tend to be the ones that do that, that want new thinking and move on it. So Penn becomes so important in my view. Pennsylvania is just absolutely huge. Biden's from there. Whether that matters or not, it's a different question. They are basically divided in half, east and west. Pittsburgh very much will probably vote for Trump, but places like Philly and Sentosa will probably also vote for Biden. So it's so close, Pennsylvania. It's a fascinating state. And then, as I said, he needs to pick up Michigan and either Wisconsin or Minnesota. He needs at least 2 out of those 3. So yes, if he lost Florida, that's the permutations that need to happen to get him across the line. Kai's got a question. Which markets will you personally be trading? Okay, Kai, I can say this just from a personal point of view. As I said, for me, it'll be the basket, but that's all I can say. I can't go any further than that. There's always that question around, whether it blurs into advice, and I tend to be very, very conservative on that. So sorry, mate, I can't sort of say much more, but it'll be me. I'll be watching the basket and using that in terms of what I do. Another one from Mark. Actually, these are great questions. So Penn to Biden, Florida and North Carolina to Trump, but Biden can still win even without Florida. However, Trump can't win without Florida. No, he could. It would be if he picked up Florida and then picked up Pennsylvania, it'd be game over as well. But just on the current numbers, if Trump loses Florida, it's game over. If he wins it, it's game on, because all of a sudden it gets much, much tighter. But the numbers would make it very, very tight if he lost Florida alone. So that's why, for me, Florida is so key. If Trump picks it up, it's game on, because all of a sudden it gets tight. But in terms of the numbers, those 29 electoral college votes that come with Florida, if Biden picks that up, it's game over, because Trump won't have enough in the states that he goes forward with to get across the line. So it's a great permutation question, and that's why, as I said last week, and I'll say it again today, for me, Florida's key. If Florida falls to Biden, it's game over. If Trump wins it, and I still think he can actually, and I probably actually think he will, then it's game on. And that's why Pennsylvania all of a sudden becomes so important. And Mark, pleasure. The response from Mark there was good analysis. Thanks a lot, mate. Pleasure. And I'm glad you put all those questions out there. And I'm glad you've clearly got personal thoughts as well. And I'm happy to read them out if you've got them. But this is why this discussion is so important, because the permutations are huge. And it's why this is still a wide open race. This just is far from over in terms of what happened. And those purple states are going to be unbelievable to watch. And as I said to you at the start of this whole thing, the thing that we don't know is how many people have gone in through postal votes and how long it takes for those postal votes to actually come in. As I said last week, normally Florida will declare roughly around about 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time on the Wednesday. But there is an incredible amount of postal votes going in Florida, and it may not happen on the day, and we have to be ready for that as well, and what that could actually mean. So Mark's done actually a bit more analysis, and this is a great one. As he said, I think Biden scores 330 odd seats and 301 without Florida. And that's, Mark, that's true. That's where I come up to. But again, at the moment, Trump's running around in the Rust Belts. Who knows what he can pick up there? I mean, he's going to basically blitzkrieg the hell out of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, over the next 10 to 15 days. And that's why I'm with you. I think that's probably likely. I think 300 is where Biden will end up with. That's in my view anyway. But again, who knows? And with regards to how it works, whether or not the polls have caught enough people, there are a lot of very, very quiet voters out there that sometimes don't get to it. Guys, thank you for tonight. I'm going to wrap it up there. We've basically been going for 55 minutes. I think it's a really fantastic session. We are, 11 days away. So, sorry, not 11 days away. We are 14, 15 days away. It's still a long way to go in terms of what happens inside markets and inside this election. Keep your stops about. We will be doing one more of these before the election, and then we'll do one post. Very, very exciting times, and good luck, good trading. Talk to you soon.